When Margaret Hayes clutched her divorce papers and the last $2 to her name outside a Kansas courthouse in 1867, she never imagined those coins would buy her more than just a banished mountain man's labor. They would purchase her first glimpse of true worth. But when Daniel Crow spoke her name with a reverence no one had ever shown her before, causing her to fall to her knees in overwhelming recognition, would she finally understand that some prices reveal value far beyond what money can measure? The courthouse door slammed shut behind Margaret Hayes with a sound like thunder, making every person on Main Street turn to stare. Her hands shook as she held the papers that changed everything. Words written in black ink that said her 12-year marriage was over forever. Barren and unfit, she whispered, reading the terrible words her husband James had written about her. The October wind in Millbrook, Kansas grabbed the papers and tried to pull them from her fingers, but Margaret held on tight. These papers were proof of the worst day of her life, but they were also proof she was finally free. Mrs. Henderson from the general store walked by with her nose high in the air. "Some women just can't keep a man happy," she said loud enough for Margaret to hear. No wonder James Hayes wanted rid of her. Margaret's face burned red like fire. Everyone in town was talking about her now. The woman who couldn't have babies. The wife who got thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. Her stomach growled with hunger, but when she looked in her small cloth purse, all she found were $2 silver. 2 whole dollars. Everything she owned in the world, after 12 years of cooking, cleaning, and trying to make James smile. The boarding house where she lived now cost $1.50 each week. Her room was tiny, with walls so thin she could hear Mrs. Proplig the manners. Caldwell next door talking mean things about her every single night. That Margaret Hayes brings shame to decent folks, Mrs. Caldwell would say, walking around town like she's got nothing to be sorry for. Margaret pulled her worn shawl closer around her shoulders. The holes in it let the cold air through, but she had no money for a new one. She walked slowly down the wooden sidewalk, her old boots making soft sounds on the boards. The town of Millbrook stretched out in front of her like a place she didn't belong anymore. False front buildings lined both sides of the dusty street. The bank, the hotel, the church with its tall white steeple pointing up to heaven. All places where people who used to nod hello to her now looked away. At the blacksmith shop, Mr. Peterson hammered red-hot metal on his anvil. The ringing sounds echoed off the buildings like church bells, but not happy ones. More like funeral bells for the life Margaret used to have. She remembered when she first came to Millbrook as James's new bride. She was 18 then, with bright eyes and big dreams about the family they would have, the house they would fill with children's laughter, the garden she would plant with roses and vegetables. But babies never came. Month after month, year after year, her body failed her. James grew colder each time she disappointed him again. His kind words turned into sharp ones. His gentle touches became rough pushes. Finally, he stopped touching her at all. "Maybe God's trying to tell you something," he said one morning over breakfast. "Maybe he knows you're not meant to be a mother." Those words cut deeper than any knife. Margaret started believing she really was broken inside, that something was wrong with her that couldn't be fixed. The worst part came last spring when James started visiting Widow Patterson's house every Tuesday and Thursday. Everyone knew what was happening, but nobody talked about it where Margaret could hear. They just gave her looks full of pity and whispered behind their hands. When Margaret found the divorce papers on the kitchen table 3 weeks ago, she wasn't even surprised. James had written down all the reasons she wasn't good enough. The law said a man could divorce a wife who couldn't give him children. The judge agreed without asking Margaret a single question. Now she walked past the church where she got married, past the house where she lived with James, her old house with the blue shutters and the garden she loved. Someone else would live there soon. Someone else would sleep in her bed and cook at her stove. A group of ladies stood outside the post office, their fancy dresses clean and pressed. When they saw Margaret coming, they stopped talking and stared. Mrs. Williams, the mayor's wife, stepped back like Margaret might be catching. "How terrible," one of them whispered. "To end up all alone like that. She should have tried harder to please her husband," another said. "A good wife finds a way to give her man what he needs." Margaret wanted to run, but her feet kept walking forward. She held her head up high, even though inside she felt smaller than an ant. These women had children and husbands who loved them. They had warm houses and full pantries. They had everything Margaret had lost. The sun was getting low in the sky, painting the clouds orange and pink. Soon it would be dark, and Margaret would have to go back to her tiny room. She would eat bread and butter for dinner again because that's all she could buy. She would listen to Mrs. Caldwell's mean words through the wall. She would lie on her narrow bed and wonder what would happen when her $2 ran out. But as she walked toward the boarding house, something made her stop. Voices were coming from the town square. Lots of voices talking loud and excited. Margaret had never been curious about town business before, but now she had nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. She followed the sounds around the corner, and what she saw made her heart beat faster. A crowd of people filled the town square like ants around spilled honey, all pushing closer to see something Margaret couldn't make out yet. Sheriff Coleman's voice boomed over everyone's heads from somewhere in the middle of all those bodies. "Step right up, folks. Monthly auction starts now." Margaret had heard about these auctions but never seen one. Her husband James always said they were no place for decent ladies. But Margaret wasn't a decent lady anymore, according to the divorce papers in her pocket. She was just a woman with $2 and nothing left to lose. She squeezed between Mr. Foster from the feed store and young Billy Thompson, trying to see what everyone was staring at. When she finally pushed through to the front, her breath caught in her throat like she'd been punched. A wooden platform stood in the center of the square, tall enough that everyone could see what was for sale. Usually the sheriff sold things like stolen horses or furniture from people who couldn't pay their debts. But today, standing on that platform like he was just another piece of property, was a man. He wasn't like the men from Millbrook with their clean faces and Sunday clothes. This man looked wild, like he belonged in the mountains or deep forests where civilized people never went. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and his clothes were made of buckskin and rough wool that had seen hard use. But it was his eyes that made Margaret stare. They were gray like storm clouds, and they looked out over the crowd without fear or shame. Most people being sold at auction looked down at their feet or begged for mercy. This man stood straight and tall, like a king who just happened to be standing on the wrong stage. "Name's Daniel Crow," Sheriff Coleman announced, reading from a piece of paper. "Caught trespassing on Indian lands up in Dakota Territory. Military says he was helping enemies of the United States government." The crowd muttered and whispered. Helping Indians was serious business. It could get a man hanged if the wrong people were in charge. But seeing as nobody got killed, and he came along peaceful-like, the court decided on banishment instead. The sheriff continued. Now he needs someone willing to take responsibility for his reform, someone to make sure he learns proper American ways. Margaret found herself staring at the man's hands. They were strong and rough from hard work, but they weren't tied up. He could have jumped down from that platform and run away if he wanted to. Instead, he stood there waiting to see what would happen next. "What kind of work can he do?" called out Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith. "Says here he can build, farm, hunt, and track," Sheriff Coleman answered. "Lived 7 years in the wilderness, so he knows how to survive on his own." "Can he read and write?" asked Mrs. Williams. "That's not mentioned," the sheriff said, "but he speaks English good enough." Margaret watched Daniel Crow's face when people talked about him like he wasn't there. His expression never changed, but something in those gray eyes made her think he understood more than he let on. "Bidding starts at 50 cents, Sheriff Coleman announced. "Who'll give me 50 cents for a strong back and steady worker?" Nobody moved. Margaret could hear people breathing and shuffling their feet, but no hands went up. "Come now, folks," the sheriff said. "This man's got to go somewhere. Can't keep him in jail forever, and we can't just turn him loose to cause more trouble." Still nobody bid. Margaret realized why. Taking responsibility for Daniel Crow meant taking responsibility for everything he might do wrong. If he ran away or caused problems, whoever bought him would have to answer to the law. 40 cents? The sheriff tried. Surely someone needs help with heavy work. The silence stretched out like a long shadow. Daniel Crow looked over the crowd with those storm-gray eyes, and for just a moment, his gaze met Margaret's. Something passed between them. Recognition of one thrown-away person looking at another. 30 cents? Sheriff Coleman's voice was getting desperate. 20 cents? Margaret's hand moved toward her purse without her mind telling it to. Her fingers touched the $2 silver inside. $2 that had to last until she figured out what to do with the rest of her life. But looking at Daniel Crow standing alone on that platform while everyone turned their backs on him, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not pity, something stronger than that. Something that made her chest feel tight and her breathing come faster. 10 cents? The sheriff called out. Someone give me 10 cents or I'll have to send him back to territorial prison. Prison. Margaret knew what that meant. Men who went to territorial prison usually died there from sickness or fighting or just giving up hope. This man with the proud shoulders and storm-cloud eyes would disappear forever, and nobody in Millbrook would care. Margaret's hand pulled out her purse before she could stop it. Her fingers found the smooth silver dollars, warm from being held close to her body. $2. Everything she had. I'll bid, she heard herself say, but her voice came out too quiet. Speak up, lady, someone in the crowd yelled. We can't hear you. Margaret's face burned red, but she made her voice louder. I'll bid. Sheriff Coleman squinted at her through the crowd. Mrs. Hayes? That you? Yes, sir. How much you bidding? Margaret's throat felt dry as sand, but she forced the words out. $2. The crowd gasped like one person. $2 was more money than most people in Millbrook saw in a month. It was enough to buy a good horse or a winter's worth of food. $2? Sheriff Coleman repeated. You sure about that, ma'am? That's a lot of money for a woman in your situation. Margaret knew what he meant. A divorced woman with no family and no job had no business spending $2 on anything, especially not on a dangerous mountain man who might slit her throat in her sleep. But she looked up at Daniel Crow again, and this time he was staring right back at her. His gray eyes weren't cold anymore. They looked surprised, like nobody had ever done anything kind for him before. I'm sure, Margaret said louder this time. Going once for $2, the sheriff called out. Going twice for $2? He paused and looked around the silent crowd. Sold to Mrs. Margaret Hayes for $2. The crowd started talking all at once, voices mixing together like water and oil. Margaret heard pieces of what they said. Has she lost her mind? What's a woman like her want with a mountain man? This won't end well. Someone should stop her. But nobody did stop her. Margaret walked forward through the crowd, her legs shaking like new leaves in wind. She climbed the steps to the platform where Sheriff Coleman waited with his hand out. Margaret pulled the $2 silver from her purse and dropped them into the sheriff's palm. They made a soft clinking sound, the sound of everything she owned in the world changing hands. He's your responsibility now, Mrs. Hayes, Sheriff Coleman said. You understand what that means? Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood anything anymore. If he runs off or causes trouble, you'll answer for it. If he breaks the law, you'll pay his fines. If he hurts someone, you'll be held responsible. I understand, Margaret said. Sheriff Coleman turned to Daniel Crow. You're free to go, long as you stay with Mrs. Hayes and follow her rules. You try to run, and it's back to prison for you. You understand? Daniel Crow spoke for the first time, his voice deep and quiet like distant thunder. I understand. Then he looked at Margaret, and she saw something in his face that made her knees feel weak. Not gratitude, exactly. Something deeper than that. Something that made her wonder what she'd just gotten herself into. The crowd was starting to break up, people heading home to tell their families about the crazy thing they'd just seen. Margaret stood on the platform next to the mountain man she'd just bought with her last $2 and realized she had no idea what to do next. Daniel Crow filled Margaret's tiny boarding house room like a bear in a chicken coop, his broad shoulders making her small table and single chair look like toys meant for children. She poured coffee from her one pot with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, watching steam rise between them like a wall she couldn't see through. You didn't have to do that, he said, his voice softer than she expected from a man who looked like he could wrestle mountains. Margaret set the coffee cup in front of him and noticed how carefully his rough hands held the delicate china, like he was afraid it might break. I know. So why did you? The question hung in the air between them while Margaret tried to find words that made sense. How could she explain that seeing him standing alone on that platform felt like looking in a mirror? That buying his freedom with her last $2 was the first thing she'd done in years that felt right. I needed help, she said finally, which wasn't a lie but wasn't the whole truth either. Daniel studied her face with those storm-gray eyes. Help with what? You don't look like someone who owns land that needs working. Before Margaret could answer, Mrs. Providus, Caldwell's voice came through the thin wall like a knife cutting paper. Mark my words, Ethel. That woman's completely lost her senses. First, she gets herself divorced. Now she brings that wild savage right into our decent establishment. Margaret's cheeks burned hot enough to start fires, but Daniel's expression didn't change. She wondered how many times he'd heard people talk about him like he was dangerous, just for being different. "Is there somewhere else we can go?" Daniel asked quietly. Margaret's mind raced. She couldn't stay here much longer anyway. Not with no money coming in, and the whole town watching her every move. But where could a divorced woman and a banished mountain man go together without causing even more talk? Then she remembered her grandmother's words from long ago. "Child, when life gets too heavy to carry, sometimes you got to put it down and walk somewhere new." "There's a cabin," Margaret heard herself saying, 20 miles north near Willow Creek. Belonged to my grandmother before she passed. Daniel leaned forward. "Is it livable?" "It was last time I saw it, but that was 3 years ago." Margaret wrapped her hands around her own coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep through her fingers. "It needs work before winter comes." "What kind of work?" "Roof repairs, probably. New chinking between the logs. The well might need cleaning." Margaret paused. "I don't know if I can afford to pay you proper wages." Something that might have been a smile flickered across Daniel's face. "Lady, you just spent your last $2 to keep me out of prison. I think we're past worrying about proper wages." A loud knock on the door made them both jump. Margaret opened it to find Mr. Garrison, the boarding house owner, standing in the hallway with his arms crossed and his face red as a sunset. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm afraid there's been a complaint," he said, not looking at Daniel, but clearly talking about him. "Some of our guests feel uncomfortable with certain elements being brought into the establishment." "Certain elements?" Margaret's voice came out sharper than she intended. "You know what I mean. This isn't the kind of place for his type." Daniel stood up behind Margaret, and she felt rather than saw Mr. Garrison take a step backward. But when Daniel spoke, his voice was calm and polite. "We'll be leaving first thing tomorrow morning, sir. No trouble intended." Mr. Garrison nodded quickly and hurried away without another word. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, feeling like the walls were closing in around her. "I'm sorry," she said. "This town, they're not usually." "Yes, they are," Daniel said without anger. "Most towns are. That's why I stayed in the mountains so long." "Why did you leave?" Daniel sat back down and stared into his coffee cup like he was reading his future in the dark liquid. Someone needed help getting home before the snow came. A Lakota family. Grandmother, mother, 3 children. The father died in a hunting accident, and they were too far from their winter camp to make it alone. "So you helped them?" "I helped them. Military patrol caught us crossing what the government calls federal land. The family made it home safe, but I got arrested for aiding enemies of the state." Margaret felt something twist in her chest. They were just trying to get home. That's what I told the judge. He wasn't interested in hearing about hungry children or winter storms, just about laws and boundaries and keeping people in their proper places. The bitterness in Daniel's voice made Margaret think about her own situation. James had tried to keep her in her proper place too, the place of a wife who served and obeyed and never questioned why she wasn't enough. "How do you know so much about building and fixing things?" she asked, wanting to change the subject to something less painful. "My father was a carpenter back in Ohio. Taught me to work with my hands before I could hardly walk." Daniel's expression softened. "After he died, my mother married a man who didn't want a stepson around. I left when I was 16 and headed west. That must have been hard. Harder for my mother, I think. But I learned to take care of myself. Spent time with trappers and hunters who taught me about living off the land. Then I found the Black Hills and decided that was where I belonged." "What were they like?" "The Black Hills." Daniel's whole face changed when he talked about the mountains. His eyes got distant and peaceful, like he was seeing something beautiful that only he could see. "Wild," he said. "Clean. Quiet except for wind and water and animals going about their business. A man could think clear thoughts there, could be himself without anybody telling him who he was supposed to be." Margaret understood that feeling, even though she'd never lived anywhere wild. Sometimes when she worked in her garden back at James's house, she'd felt something similar. Like the earth and growing things didn't care about her failures or judge her for what she couldn't do. "You miss it," she said, "every day." Daniel looked at her directly. "But maybe your grandmother's cabin won't be so different. If it's far enough from town and close enough to the creek." "It is. Grandmother chose that spot because she said it felt like peace. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. She's the one who taught me to read and write. Said education was the one thing nobody could take away from a woman, no matter what else happened. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Reading and writing are useful skills. I never learned much of either. I could teach you, Margaret offered before she could stop herself. If you wanted to learn. Daniel looked surprised. You'd do that? Why not? If we're going to be living in the same place anyway. Something passed between them then. Not romance or attraction, but the beginning of understanding. Two people who'd been thrown away by their worlds, finding something in each other that might be worth keeping. Outside the window, the sun was setting behind Millbrook's buildings, painting the sky orange and purple. Tomorrow they would leave this place where neither of them belonged, and try to build something new in the wilderness. Margaret felt scared and hopeful at the same time. She'd never lived anywhere without neighbors close by, never had to depend on just herself and one other person to survive. But sitting across from Daniel Crow in her tiny room, she thought maybe that was exactly what she needed. We should get some sleep, she said. It's a long ride to the cabin. Daniel nodded and stood up. I'll sleep outside. Don't want to cause you more trouble than I already have. You haven't caused me any trouble, Margaret said. The trouble was already here. You just gave me a reason to leave it behind. As Daniel headed for the door, Margaret realized she'd made the first real choice of her adult life. Not a choice someone else forced on her or expected her to make, but something she decided for herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new fears. But tonight, for the first time in years, Margaret Hayes fell asleep, feeling like she was finally heading somewhere that might feel like home. The wagon wheels creaked and bumped over every rock and hole in the rough trail leading north from Millbrook, making Margaret's bones ache with each jolt. Daniel walked beside the borrowed wagon, leading the old mare Mr. Peterson had rented them for the journey, his long legs easily matching the horse's steady pace. How much farther? Margaret called down from the driver's seat, trying to keep her voice steady as another bump nearly threw her sideways. See that line of cottonwoods up ahead? Daniel pointed to a ribbon of golden trees stretching across the horizon. That's Willow Creek. Your grandmother's cabin should be somewhere along there. Margaret squinted against the afternoon sun, her heart beating faster with each step that brought them closer to their destination. What if the cabin had fallen down? What if animals had moved in? What if she'd remembered wrong and it wasn't livable at all? The October air was getting colder as the day wore on, and Margaret pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Daniel noticed and stopped walking. You're cold, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm fine. No, you're not. Daniel reached into the back of the wagon and pulled out a thick wool blanket. Here, we still have an hour of travel left. Margaret wanted to refuse. She'd been taking care of herself just fine, thank you very much. But the blanket was warm and soft, and she was tired of being cold all the time. Thank you, she said, wrapping it around herself. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you see what kind of shape this cabin is in. As they got closer to the creek, Margaret started recognizing landmarks from her childhood visits. The old lightning-struck oak with its hollow trunk, the boulder shaped like a sleeping giant, the bend in the creek where she used to catch minnows with her bare hands. There, she said, pointing through the trees. I can see the roof. Daniel looked where she pointed and nodded. Looks like it's still standing. That's something. They guided the wagon through the last stretch of woods and came out into a small clearing beside Willow Creek. Margaret's grandmother's cabin sat in the middle of the open space like it had been waiting for them to come home. It was smaller than Margaret remembered, but solid-looking, built from thick logs with a stone chimney at one end and a covered porch across the front. The roof sagged in a couple of places, and some of the chinking between the logs had fallen out, but the basic structure looked sound. It's beautiful, Daniel said, and Margaret heard genuine appreciation in his voice. She climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the front door, her feet remembering the path even after all these years. The key was still hidden under the loose stone by the steps, just where grandmother always kept it. The door opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through dirty windows, and everything smelled like old wood and forgotten time. But the furniture was still there. Grandmother's rocking chair by the fireplace, the kitchen table she'd made herself, the narrow bed in the back room. Cobwebs hung in the corners like lace curtains, and mouse droppings scattered across the floor told stories of tiny visitors, but nothing looked damaged beyond repair. "The roof needs work," Daniel said from behind her, looking up at water stains on the ceiling. "And we'll need to fill those gaps in the walls before the cold weather really sets in." "Can you do it?" Margaret asked. "The repairs, I mean." Daniel ran his hand along one of the log walls, testing how solid it was. "I can do most of it. Might need to go back to town for supplies. Nails, some new boards, materials for chinking." Margaret's stomach dropped. "I don't have money for supplies." "I've got some," Daniel said. "Not much, but enough for basics. I wasn't allowed to keep much when they arrested me, but I had a few dollars hidden away." "I can't let you spend your money on my grandmother's cabin." Daniel turned to look at her directly. "Our cabin now, isn't it? If we're both going to live here?" The word "our" made something flutter in Margaret's chest. She'd never owned anything with another person as an equal partner. Everything in her marriage had belonged to James. The house, the furniture, even the clothes she wore. "I suppose it is," she said. They spent the rest of the afternoon unloading the wagon and exploring their new home. The well behind the cabin still had clear, sweet water. The root cellar was dry and empty, but ready to store winter vegetables. The small barn could shelter the horse and provide workspace for repairs. As the sun started setting, Daniel built a fire in the stone fireplace while Margaret swept out the worst of the dust and cobwebs. The familiar tasks felt good after the uncertainty of the past few weeks. "I found something," Daniel called from the kitchen area. Margaret came over to see what he'd discovered. In a wooden box on the top shelf, wrapped in faded cloth, were her grandmother's dishes, plates, and cups painted with tiny blue flowers. "She saved the good china," Margaret whispered, running her fingers over the delicate patterns. "I remember eating off these plates when I was little. Grandmother said they came all the way from Pennsylvania with her mother. Must be important to her family then." "They are." Margaret carefully lifted one of the cups, remembering tea parties with grandmother on rainy afternoons. She used to say that beauty wasn't a luxury. It was necessary for the soul. "Smart woman. She would have liked you," Margaret said, then felt her face get hot. Why had she said that? It sounded too personal, too familiar. But Daniel just smiled. "What makes you think so?" "She always said a person's worth wasn't measured by what other people thought of them, but by how they treated others when nobody was watching." "And you think I treat people well when nobody's watching?" Margaret thought about how gently he'd held her coffee cup that morning, how he'd walked beside the wagon instead of riding to make sure she was comfortable, how he'd offered his own money for repairs without expecting anything in return. "I think you do," she said. As night fell around their little cabin, Margaret and Daniel shared a simple dinner of bread and cheese by the fire. The flames painted dancing shadows on the log walls, and the sound of Willow Creek babbling outside the windows made the whole place feel peaceful. "What will people in town say when they find out we're living out here together?" Margaret asked. Daniel poked at the fire with a long stick, sending sparks up the chimney. "Probably nothing good. Doesn't that worry you?" "Not really. I stopped caring what most people thought a long time ago." He looked at her across the fire. "Does it worry you?" Margaret considered the question. A few weeks ago, the answer would have been yes. She'd spent her whole life trying to be what other people expected. The perfect daughter, the obedient wife, the proper lady who never caused trouble. But sitting in her grandmother's cabin with a man who'd been branded a criminal for helping hungry children get home, Margaret realized those expectations had never made her happy. They just made her small. "Not as much as I thought it would," she said. "Good. Because we've got enough real problems to worry about, without adding imaginary ones." "What kind of real problems?" Daniel gestured toward the ceiling where wind was whistling through gaps in the roof. "Winter's coming fast. We need to get this place weatherproofed in the next few weeks, or we'll freeze before spring. Can we do it in time? If we work hard, and the weather holds." Daniel stood up and stretched. "But we should get some sleep. Tomorrow we start finding out what we're really made of." As Margaret settled into her grandmother's old bed, she listened to Daniel moving around in the main room, banking the fire and securing the door. Strange how safe she felt with this man she'd known for less than 2 days. Safer than she'd felt in years of sleeping next to her own husband. Outside, an owl called from the cottonwoods, and something splashed in the creek. Night sounds that had probably welcomed her grandmother to sleep for decades. Now they were welcoming Margaret and Daniel to their new life in the wilderness. Tomorrow would bring hard work and new challenges, but tonight, wrapped in warm blankets in a place that felt like peace. Margaret allowed herself to hope that buying Daniel Crow's freedom might have been the smartest thing she'd ever done, even if she still didn't understand why she'd done it. The hammer slipped from Daniel's frozen fingers and crashed onto the cabin roof with a sound like breaking bones, making Margaret's heart jump as she looked up from hanging wet laundry on the line. 3 weeks of November cold had turned their breath to white clouds and made every task twice as hard, but they were winning the race against winter, barely. "You all right up there?" Margaret called, squinting against the pale morning sun. "Fine," Daniel answered, but she could hear the strain in his voice. He'd been working since dawn, replacing broken roof boards with lumber they'd bought on their last trip to town. His hands were raw and bleeding from the cold, but he kept going because they both knew the first real snow could come any day. Margaret hung the last shirt on the line and wiped her hands on her apron. The clothes would probably freeze before they dried, but at least they'd be clean. She was walking back toward the cabin when she heard something that made her blood turn to ice water. The sound of horses coming fast through the woods. "Daniel," she called, her voice tight with fear. He was already climbing down from the roof, moving quick and silent like a cat. His gray eyes swept the tree line, searching for whatever was coming their way. "How many?" he asked quietly. "At least 3 horses. Maybe more." Daniel dropped to the ground and moved to stand beside Margaret. She noticed he positioned himself between her and the sound of approaching riders, and something about that protective gesture made her feel both grateful and afraid. The first horse burst through the trees like a dark storm cloud, and Margaret's worst fears came true. James Hayes sat tall in his saddle, dressed in his finest coat and wearing the cold smile she remembered from their worst fights. Behind him rode 2 men she didn't recognize, hard-looking strangers with guns on their hips and mean eyes that missed nothing. "Margaret!" James called out as he guided his horse into their small clearing. "There you are, hiding away like some kind of hermit." Margaret stepped forward, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What do you want, James?" "I've come to take you home, of course." James swung down from his saddle and walked toward them with the confident stride of a man used to getting his way. "This foolishness has gone on long enough." "I am home," Margaret said, surprised by how sure she sounded. James's smile got colder. "You're living in sin with a savage, Margaret. The whole county is talking about it. It reflects badly on my reputation." One of the hired men, a thin fellow with nervous hands, spoke up. "Mr. Hayes is being generous, ma'am. He's willing to take you back, long as you come quietly and send the redskin away." Margaret felt Daniel tense beside her, but his voice stayed calm when he answered. "The lady's made her choice." "The lady is still my wife in the eyes of God," James snapped. "Not according to the law," Margaret said, pulling the divorce papers from her apron pocket. "You made sure of that." James's face darkened. "Legal papers don't change what's right and wrong. A decent woman doesn't run off to live alone with a man like him." "What kind of man is that?" Daniel asked, his voice getting quieter and more dangerous. The second hired gun, a big man with scars on his knuckles, stepped closer. "The kind that helps enemies of the United States. The kind that can't be trusted around white women." Margaret saw Daniel's hands slowly curl into fists, and she knew they were seconds away from violence. 3 armed men against 1. Odds that would end with Daniel dead, and her dragged back to a life she'd rather die than live. "Stop," she said loudly, stepping between the men. "Just stop." James looked at her with the same disappointed expression he'd worn through their entire marriage. "Margaret, you're being hysterical. These mountain men fill women's heads with romantic nonsense. He's probably told you all sorts of lies about caring for you." "He's never lied to me," Margaret said. "Of course he has. Men like him don't care about anything except their own survival. He's using you for shelter and food, and when spring comes, he'll disappear and leave you with nothing." Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest, not from James's words, but from the realization that she didn't believe them, not for a second. In 3 weeks of working together, sharing meals, and talking by the fire each evening, Daniel had never once made her feel used or foolish or worthless. "You're wrong," she said. "I'm trying to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life," James insisted. "Come home now, and we can tell people you were temporarily confused, overcome by female hysteria. No one will blame you for that." Margaret looked at the cabin behind them. Their cabin, with its patched roof and warm fireplace and kitchen table, where she and Daniel ate breakfast together each morning. She looked at the creek where she'd learned to catch fish with her bare hands. She looked at the clothesline where her dresses hung next to Daniel's shirts like they belonged together. Then she looked at James, sitting straight and proud on his horse, offering to take her back to a life where she'd been slowly dying for 12 years. "No," she said. "What?" I said, "No. I won't come back with you." James's face went red. "Margaret, don't make me do this the hard way." "What's the hard way?" Daniel asked, and something in his tone made all three visitors take a step backward. The nervous hired gun's hand moved toward his pistol. "Mr. Hayes has legal right to protect his wife from dangerous influences." "Former wife," Daniel corrected. "And she's not being influenced by anyone. She's making her own choices." "Savage doesn't get to make decisions about white women," the big man growled. That's when everything went wrong at once. The nervous man drew his gun, but Daniel was already moving. He dove sideways, knocking Margaret out of the line of fire as the pistol cracked like thunder. The bullet splintered the cabin door, where Margaret had been standing. Daniel rolled and came up running, tackling the shooter before he could fire again. They crashed to the ground together, fighting for control of the weapon. The big man drew his own gun and aimed at Daniel's back, but Margaret screamed, "No!" and threw herself forward, grabbing his arm just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wild, scaring the horses and sending birds exploding from the trees. James shouted something Margaret couldn't hear over the ringing in her ears. The nervous man's gun went spinning across the clearing as Daniel's fist connected with his jaw. The big man cursed and tried to shake Margaret off his arm, but she held on like her life depended on it. Because it did. Then, suddenly, over all the shouting and struggling, a new voice cut through the chaos like a sword. "Drop your weapons, now!" Everyone froze. Sheriff Coleman sat on his horse at the edge of the clearing, pointing a rifle at the whole group. Behind him were two deputies, also armed and ready for trouble. "I said drop them," Coleman repeated. "All of you." The big man slowly lowered his pistol and let it fall to the ground. Daniel released the nervous gunman and stepped back, his hands raised to show he wasn't holding any weapons. "That's better," the sheriff said, riding closer. "Now, would someone like to explain why there's shooting going on in my territory?" James straightened his coat and put on his most reasonable voice. "Sheriff, I'm simply trying to retrieve my wife from this dangerous situation." "Former wife," Coleman corrected, making Margaret's heart leap with hope. "And last I checked, Mrs. Hayes was free to live wherever she chooses." "She's living with a criminal?" James protested. "A man who worked off his debt to society under her supervision," the sheriff replied. "His obligation to the court is finished." Margaret found her voice. "How did you know to come here?" Sheriff Coleman smiled. "Mrs. Patterson from town mentioned seeing smoke from this direction when she was visiting relatives up north. Thought I'd ride out and check on you folks. Make sure you were settling in all right." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, had been checking on them, making sure they were safe. "Well, I can see you're managing just fine," the sheriff continued, "though I'd suggest your visitors head back to town before someone gets seriously hurt." James's face was redder than a sunset. "This isn't over, Margaret." "Yes, it is," she said quietly. "It's been over for a long time. I just finally figured that out." As James and his hired men climbed back on their horses and rode away, Margaret felt something she'd never experienced before. The knowledge that she'd stood up to the person who'd hurt her most and won. But the victory felt fragile, like a soap bubble that might burst at any moment. Because deep down, she knew James was right about one thing. This wasn't over. Daniel's hands shook as he cleaned the cut on Margaret's arm where she'd scraped it during the fight, but not from the cold this time. From anger that burned hotter than any fire. She sat on the wooden chair in their kitchen while he worked, trying not to wince when he dabbed the wound with clean water. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to hide. "That man could have shot you." "He was going to shoot you," Margaret replied. "I couldn't just stand there and watch." Daniel paused in his gentle cleaning and looked at her face. "Why?" The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Margaret felt her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. How could she explain that watching someone try to hurt Daniel felt like watching them try to hurt part of herself? "Because," she started, then stopped. "Because why?" Because in 3 weeks he'd shown her more kindness than James had in 12 years? Because when he looked at her, she saw worth in his eyes instead of disappointment? Because somewhere between fixing the roof and sharing quiet dinners, she'd started to care about him in a way that scared her? Because you didn't deserve it, she said finally. Nobody deserves to be shot for helping someone. Daniel finished bandaging her arm and sat back. James was right about one thing. People will talk about us living here together. Let them talk. It won't just be talk, Margaret. Today proved that. Some folks won't be satisfied until they've driven us apart or driven us away entirely. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the clearing where they'd nearly died 20 minutes ago. The ground was churned up from the fight, and one of the fence posts Daniel had been repairing lay broken in the dirt. Are you saying we should leave? She asked. I'm saying you should think about what this costs you. Your reputation, your safety, your chance to build a normal life somewhere. Margaret turned around to face him. What's a normal life, Daniel? Going back to James and pretending to be happy while he treats me like a piece of furniture he's tired of looking at? Finding another husband who'll marry a divorced woman just for the work she can do? Living alone and letting people whisper about me until I turn into a bitter old woman who hates everyone? There might be other choices. Name one. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. You could go east. Start over somewhere nobody knows your story. Find work as a teacher or a seamstress. Build something entirely new. Without you, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Without me. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She sank back into the chair, feeling suddenly dizzy. Is that what you want? To leave? It's not about what I want. Daniel's voice was careful, controlled. It's about what's best for you. Don't I get to decide what's best for me? Do you? Really? Daniel leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. Margaret, you've spent your whole life having other people make your choices. Your parents chose James for you. James chose how you'd live and what you'd do and when you'd speak. Now I'm here, and maybe you think I'm choosing for you too. Margaret felt anger flare in her chest. That's not true. Isn't it? You bought me to solve a problem, needing help with property, you said. But there is no property problem. There's just you, trying to figure out how to live, and me, grateful enough to go along with whatever you need. Stop. Margaret's voice came out sharper than she intended. Just stop. I'm trying to be honest with you. No, you're trying to push me away. Just like everyone else does when they decide I'm too much trouble to keep around. Daniel looked like she'd slapped him. That's not what I'm doing. Then what are you doing? He was quiet so long Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm trying not to be selfish. Selfish how? By wanting to stay here with you, when I know it's going to bring you nothing but pain. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, but this time it wasn't painful. It was like a door opening after being locked for years. Daniel, she said softly, look at me. He raised his eyes to meet hers. I've been in pain for most of my adult life, not because of gossips or hired guns or angry ex-husbands, because I forgot who I was underneath all the things other people wanted me to be. She stood up and walked over to him. These past 3 weeks, working beside you, talking with you, building something together, that's the first time I've felt like myself since I was a girl. Margaret, I'm not finished. She knelt down so they were eye to eye. You want to know what's best for me? Having someone who sees me as a person worth protecting. Having someone who trusts me to make my own choices, even when they're hard ones. Having someone who says my name like it means something. Daniel's expression softened. Your name does mean something. Then say it. Margaret. No. Say it the way you did that first night, when we were talking by the fire and you told me about the Black Hills. Say it like you said it when James was here, and you wanted him to know I wasn't alone anymore. Daniel reached out and touched her bandaged arm gently. When he spoke, his voice carried something that made her knees weak. Margaret Rose. The way he said her full name, with tenderness and respect, and something deeper than friendship, made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. She realized she was crying, but they weren't sad tears. That's the first time anyone has said my name like that, she whispered. Like what? Like it's beautiful. Like I'm beautiful. Daniel's thumb brushed away a tear from her cheek. You are beautiful, Margaret Rose, inside and out. Any man too blind to see that doesn't deserve you. Margaret felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a lock she'd forgotten existed. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be valued, not for what she could do or provide, but simply for who she was. "I want to stay here," she said. "With you, no matter what James does or what people say or how hard it gets." "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Daniel smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him since the day she bought his freedom. "Then we stay." Outside, the November wind rattled the windows and sent leaves skittering across the clearing. Winter was coming fast, and there would be more challenges ahead, more cold nights, more hard work, more people who wanted to tear apart what they were building together. But sitting in their warm kitchen with her hand in Daniel's, and her name still echoing in the air between them like a prayer, Margaret Hayes felt something she'd never felt before. She felt like she was home. Snow fell like white feathers from a gray December sky, covering Margaret and Daniel's footprints as they walked back from checking their animal traps. But the real storm brewing wasn't coming from the clouds above. It was riding hard toward their cabin in the form of 6 armed men, led by someone Margaret had hoped never to see again. "Daniel, look," Margaret whispered, pointing through the falling snow toward their clearing. James Hayes sat on his horse in front of their cabin door like he owned the place, but this time he wasn't alone with hired guns. Beside him rode Marshal Thompson from the territorial government, a man whose word carried the weight of federal law. Behind them came 4 soldiers in blue uniforms, their rifles ready and their faces grim as winter itself. "Federal marshals," Daniel said quietly, recognizing the badges and authority that meant serious trouble. "This isn't about a domestic dispute anymore." Margaret's stomach dropped like a stone in deep water. "What do you think they want?" "Nothing good." Daniel handed her the 3 rabbits they'd caught and started walking toward the cabin. "Stay behind me, and whatever happens, don't try to protect me this time." "But Daniel..." "Promise me," Margaret rose. "If shooting starts, you run for the woods and keep running until you reach town." Margaret wanted to argue, but something in Daniel's voice told her this was different from James's last visit. Bigger, more dangerous. The kind of trouble that could destroy everything they'd built together. They walked into the clearing with their hands visible and their movements slow and careful. Marshal Thompson climbed down from his horse and unfolded a piece of official paper. "Daniel Crow," the marshal announced in a voice that carried across the snowy clearing. "You're under arrest for violation of federal treaty laws and conspiracy against the United States government." Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. "What are you talking about? He hasn't done anything wrong." "Ma'am, we have reports that this man has been in contact with hostile Indian tribes, providing them with information about military movements and supply routes." "That's impossible," Margaret said. "He's been here with me for 2 months. He hasn't left the cabin except to go to town for supplies." James spoke up from his horse, his voice smooth as oil on water. "Margaret, you've been deceived. While you thought he was helping with repairs, he's been sneaking out at night to meet with Lakota war parties." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Marshal Thompson held up the paper. "We have a sworn statement from a reliable witness who saw you meeting with Chief Red Hawk's son near Bent Creek on 3 separate occasions." "What witness?" Margaret demanded. James smiled coldly. "Someone who knows the area well. Someone concerned about the safety of innocent settlers." Margaret realized with growing horror that James had set this whole thing up. The charges, the witness, the federal involvement, all of it designed to get Daniel away from her permanently. "You did this," she said to James, her voice shaking with rage. "You made up these lies because you couldn't stand that I chose someone else over you." "I'm protecting you from a dangerous criminal," James replied, "and protecting this territory from someone who aids our enemies." One of the soldiers stepped forward with iron chains. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered Daniel. Daniel looked at Margaret one last time, and she saw something in his gray eyes that made her heart break. Not fear for himself, but sadness for what this would do to her. "Wait," Margaret said desperately. "You can't just arrest him based on some anonymous witness. Where's your proof?" Marshal Thompson folded the paper and put it back in his coat. The witness provided detailed information about meeting times and locations. That's enough for an arrest. If he's innocent, he can prove it at trial. "What trial?" "You're taking him to territorial prison, and we both know men don't come back from there alive. Ma'am, I understand you have feelings for this man, but you need to step aside and let us do our job. Margaret moved to stand between Daniel and the soldiers, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. I won't let you take him. Margaret, don't, Daniel said quietly. You'll only make it worse for yourself. I don't care about myself, she cried. They're going to kill you, and I can't stand by and watch it happen. James's voice cut through the falling snow like a knife. Margaret, be reasonable. Come home with me now, and we can forget this whole unfortunate episode. I'm willing to take you back despite everything that's happened. Margaret looked at James sitting proud on his horse, offering her a life of safety and respectability in exchange for watching the man she'd come to love disappear forever. She looked at the federal marshal and his soldiers, representing a government that would destroy Daniel for the crime of being different and kind. She looked at Daniel, standing straight and tall despite the chains they wanted to put on him, ready to sacrifice himself to keep her safe. Then she made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. Marshal Thompson, she said in a voice stronger than she'd ever heard from herself before, I'm the witness you're looking for. Everyone stared at her. What? The marshal said. I'm the person who's been with Daniel Crowe every night for the past 2 months. I can swear under oath that he hasn't left this property except to accompany me to town. Your witness is lying. James's face went red. Margaret, you don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying someone paid a man to lie about Daniel so they could have him arrested on false charges. Marshal Thompson looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, are you saying you're willing to testify under oath about Mr. Crowe's whereabouts? I am, and I'm saying that whoever your witness is, he's either mistaken or lying for money. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. The marshal looked at James, then at Daniel, then back at Margaret. Something in her steady gaze seemed to convince him that she was telling the truth. Mr. Hayes, the marshal said slowly, I think we need to have a conversation about your witness. James shifted in his saddle. What kind of conversation? The kind where you explain how your witness could have seen Mr. Crowe in 2 places at the same time. Margaret felt a surge of hope. The marshal was starting to doubt the charges. If she could just keep talking, keep making her case. There's something else, she said. Daniel Crowe has been helping me prepare this cabin for winter. We have receipts from the hardware store in town showing when he bought supplies. We have neighbors who've seen him working on the roof. Anyone who knows this area can verify that it's impossible to get from here to Bent Creek and back in 1 night without a horse, and our horse has been sick with a pulled muscle for the past 3 weeks. The marshal turned to one of his soldiers. Corporal, check the horse. The soldier walked to their small barn and came back a few minutes later. Horse is definitely favoring its left front legs, sir. Looks like an old injury. Margaret saw doubt creeping into the marshal's expression. James saw it too, and his confident smile started to slip. Marshal, James said quickly, you can't take the word of a woman who's clearly been compromised by this man's influence. I can take the word of someone who's willing to swear an oath and provide evidence to back up her claims, the marshal replied, which is more than your witness seems willing to do. That's when Margaret realized they might actually win this fight, not with guns or violence, but with truth and courage and the kind of stubborn determination her grandmother had always said was worth more than gold. But James wasn't finished. He had one more card to play, and it was the cruelest one of all. Margaret, he said, his voice turning soft and dangerous, if you continue down this path, I'll make sure everyone in 3 counties knows you've been living in sin with a savage. No decent person will ever speak to you again. You'll be completely ruined. Margaret looked at him sitting there on his horse, trying to destroy her reputation to get what he wanted. She thought about all the years she'd spent being afraid of exactly what he was threatening. The gossip, the shame, the loneliness of being cast out from polite society. Then she thought about Daniel teaching her to fish with her bare hands, about quiet evenings by the fire sharing stories and dreams, about the way he said her name like it was something precious, about waking up each morning in a place that felt like home. James, she said calmly, I don't care. What? I said I don't care what people think anymore. I'd rather be ruined and happy than respectable and miserable. The words rang out across the snowy clearing like a bell, clear and final and true. Margaret felt something inside her settle into place, like a piece of herself she'd been missing for years finally coming home. James stared at her in shock. The marshal looked impressed despite himself. The soldiers shuffled their feet and waited for orders. And Daniel Crowe smiled. Spring sunlight streamed through the clean windows of Margaret's cabin as she stood at the kitchen table, reading a letter that had arrived with the morning mail delivery from town. The paper trembled slightly in her hands, but not from fear this time. From excitement that made her heart race like a young girl's. "What's it say?" Daniel asked from the doorway, where he'd been watching her face change expression 3 times in the past minute. "It's from Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife." Margaret looked up at him with eyes bright as new pennies. "She says the school board has voted to offer me the position of teacher for the settlement children. $15 a month, plus supplies." Daniel set down the wood he'd been carrying and walked over to her. "That's wonderful news. You'll be a fine teacher." "There's more." Margaret's voice got stronger as she continued reading. "She says several families have asked specifically for me because they heard I helped teach you to read over the winter. They want someone who has patience with students who are starting late." The winter had been long and cold, but it had also been the happiest time of Margaret's life. While snow piled up outside their cabin, she and Daniel had spent evenings by the fire with her grandmother's old books, working through letters and words until Daniel could read simple stories on his own. Teaching him had reminded Margaret how much she loved helping others learn. "When do they want you to start?" Daniel asked. "Next month, when the new schoolhouse is finished." Margaret folded the letter carefully. "But Daniel, there's something we need to talk about." She saw worry flicker across his face. After everything they'd been through, the false charges that Marshal Thompson had dropped when his investigation proved James's witness was lying, the long winter of proving they could build a life together, the gradual acceptance they'd won from some of the more open-minded townspeople, Daniel still sometimes expected bad news. "What is it?" he asked. Margaret took a deep breath. "If I take this job, everyone in 3 counties will know exactly where I am and what I'm doing. There won't be any hiding from gossip or judgment anymore. And I want to make sure you're ready for that. People will talk about us, Daniel. They'll say things about you being with a woman who works outside the home. They'll say things about me being with a man who was once arrested. Some folks will never accept us, no matter what we do." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window toward Willow Creek, where they'd learned to find peace together. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful and sure. Margaret rose. "I've spent most of my life worrying about what other people thought of me. It made me bitter and lonely and angry at the world." He turned to look at her directly. "These past months with you have taught me something important." "What's that?" "That the only opinions that matter are the ones that come from people who actually know us. People who see how we treat each other and how we live our lives." Daniel reached out and took her hands. "Mrs. Patterson knows us. Sheriff Coleman knows us. The families asking for you to teach their children, they know us too." Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they were good tears. "So you think I should take the job?" "I think you should do whatever makes you happy. And I think teaching those children will make you very happy indeed." Margaret threw her arms around Daniel's neck and hugged him tight. "It will. Oh, Daniel, it really will." As they held each other in the sunny kitchen, Margaret thought about how far they'd both come since that autumn day when she'd spent her last $2 on a mountain man's freedom. She'd bought Daniel to solve what she thought was a practical problem. But what she'd really bought was the chance to discover who she could become when someone believed in her worth. "There's something else in the letter," she said, pulling back to look at Daniel's face. "More good news, I hope. Mrs. Patterson says the Church Ladies Auxiliary wants to commission me to organize a lending library for the settlement. They heard about grandmother's books and want to start a collection that families can borrow from." Daniel's smile got wider. "Sounds like you're going to be a very busy woman." "We're going to be busy. I'll need help building shelves and organizing everything. And someone will have to help me choose which books are suitable for different ages. Someone who learned to read using those same books?" "Someone exactly like that." They spent the rest of the morning planning how they'd turn the cabin's front room into a combination school and library space. Daniel would build new shelves and desks, while Margaret organized the books and prepared lessons. Together, they'd create something the whole community could use and be proud of. Around noon, they took a break to eat lunch on the porch, listening to birds sing in the cottonwood trees and watching clouds drift across the blue Kansas sky. Margaret looked at Daniel sitting beside her, his face peaceful and content. and felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the path that had brought them together. "Daniel," she said quietly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't bid on you that day?" Sometimes. He considered the question seriously. "I probably would have gone to territorial prison, might not have survived it. And I probably would have spent my last $2 on food, and then, I don't know what I would have done after that. Found something else. You're stronger than you knew back then." Margaret shook her head. "I was broken back then, completely lost. I didn't know who I was or what I was worth or how to make my own choices." "What changed?" Margaret thought about it. "You did. Not because you fixed me. I had to do that myself. But because you saw something in me that I'd forgotten was there." "What did I see?" "Worth." Margaret's voice got soft with memory. "You looked at me like I mattered. Like my thoughts and feelings and dreams were important. You said my name like it was beautiful." Daniel reached over and took her hand. "It is beautiful. You are beautiful." "So are you." Margaret squeezed his fingers. "Beautiful and kind and brave and everything I never thought I deserved to have in my life. We both deserve happiness, Margaret Rose. We just had to be willing to fight for it." As the afternoon sun warmed their faces and painted golden light across their small piece of paradise, Margaret understood that their story wasn't really about a woman buying a man's freedom for $2. It was about two broken people finding each other and learning that their worth wasn't determined by what the world said about them, but by what they chose to build together. The measure of a person's worth, Margaret had learned, lies not in society's judgment or another's possession, but in the courage to forge authentic connections and the strength to honor the light within oneself, even when the whole world insists on calling it darkness. She'd paid $2 for Daniel Crow's labor, but what she'd really purchased was the chance to discover that some things, love, respect, partnership, hope, can't be bought at any price. They can only be freely given and gratefully received by people brave enough to see past the surface to the precious worth that lies beneath. As evening approached and fireflies began dancing in the meadow grass, Margaret and Daniel Hayes Crow sat on their porch, watching the sun set over their new life, knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh challenges and fresh joys in equal measure. But tonight, they were exactly where they belonged, home.